On a cold elevator line morning in October 1999, just north of Concordia in Cloud County, Brett Reynolds shut off a 1989 Ford F250 with 312,000 miles, rust along both rocker panels, and a grain auger chain wired through the tailgate latch because the original clasp had failed 2 harvests earlier. He stepped down in patched bib overalls, a faded brown coat with one cuff hand-stitched in blue thread, and boots so worn at the heel that he leaned slightly inward when he walked. 2 trucks behind him sat a pair of new diesel pickups with dealership decals, polished aluminum wheels, and clean logo jackets hanging from passenger seats. Souvenirs from winter clinics in Hutchinson, where the coffee was free and the financing sheets were ready. Nobody said it to his face at first. They waited until he walked toward the scale house window. Then one man near the loading pit said, loud enough for 4 others to hear, "That old rig is one pothole from retirement." Another answered, "He is stubborn, not scalable." Brett heard both and kept moving. He hauled wheat from 280 total acres that fall, 240 rented at $78 per acre, and 40 inherited acres he owned free and clear. His machinery line looked less like a modern package and more like a salvage yard inventory card. A 1974 John Deere 443, purchased for $8,600 cash at a December estate auction. A 1978 International 1486 bought for $6,900 from a retiring operator near Clyde, and a 1983 Combine from a yard outside Salina for $11,400 plus $2,300 in parts and bearings before it ever touched his field. Around Reno County coffee counters, he became shorthand for what not to do. Undercapitalized. Behind the era. Missing scale. The crux sat in plain sight from the beginning. Brett looked like the poorest man waiting on a grain ticket, yet he was already treating every avoided interest payment as future land ownership, and that arithmetic was patient enough to outlast laughter. He had not been born with a grand philosophy. He learned it the way many farmers learn anything durable, by watching numbers punish pride. In 1987, when he was 19, his father signed a variable rate operating note tied to expanding irrigated acreage just before input costs jumped and wheat prices flattened. The original terms looked manageable. A 9.25% start rate on $184,000 of combined carry debt and equipment. The first-year payment schedule projected $28,700 in principal and interest. Then rates moved twice, and the note reset above 12%. Fertilizer climbed. A pump failed in July. That winter, Brett watched his father stand in a machine shed and say very quietly, "The bank owns this place until we prove otherwise." They did not lose all the ground, but they sold enough to carve a permanent mark in the family story. Debt, Brett decided, was not a tool he could trust unless the downside was survivable in a bad year, then a worse year right after. By the spring of 1991, he had written his first private farm ledger on lined paper and started a rule set he never printed and rarely explained. Rule 1, no variable rate notes. Rule 2, no annual machinery payments larger than the previous 3-year average repair bill. Rule 3, every paid-off machine got a monthly transfer equal to what a payment would have been, sent to a separate savings account for land. Rule 4, cash reserve target of at least 1 full seasons of rent, seed, fertilizer, diesel, insurance, and property tax before any expansion bid. It sounded strict even then. It sounded old before he turned 25. But the numbers gave him calm. His 20s were not glamorous. In 1992, he worked winter nights at a grain facility in Concordia for $8.15 per hour, then did custom baling weekends at $9 per bale net after fuel. In 1993, he netted $27,400 total farm and off-farm income and saved $9,200. In 1994, he rented his first 80 acres at $64 per acre, grossed $19,520 on wheat and milo, and kept $6,180 after all costs and rent. In 1995, he added 60 acres, bought a used grain drill for $750, and set aside $11,300. In 1996, his grandmother passed and left him 40 acres valued at $46,000, with no debt attached. That land changed his collateral profile overnight, but he still refused long paper. In 1997, he had enough cash to replace a failing transmission and still end the year with $38,900 in reserves. In 1998, he faced his first real temptation: a dealer package with low introductory terms on a newer tractor and planter. He ran the 5-year cost 3 different ways. Even at optimistic yields, interest and depreciation together erased 2 future down payments on land. He declined. By the second week of November 1999, his system looked less like stubbornness and more like disciplined repetition. He purchased parts in winter when yards discounted unsorted inventory. He bought one machine at a time, always with an all-in cap, purchased plus repairs that he wrote on an index card and kept in his shirt pocket. He inspected auctions after church, not for shiny tractors, but for neglected implements that needed bearings, hoses, welds, patience. He changed fluids by interval, not by convenience, and tracked engine hours with a mechanical counter bolted to a plywood board in his shop. He ran oil analysis on the 4430 once a year for $22 per sample, because that one report could prevent a $6,000 failure. People called his equipment old. They were right. They missed the relevant detail. Old did not mean uncertain in his operation. Paid for meant predictable. His annual living expenses made the same argument. Housing cost was effectively zero because he lived in the original farmhouse on inherited ground and did his own repairs. Utilities averaged $2,640 per year. Food bought in bulk with a chest freezer strategy averaged $4,980. Clothing was $430. Pickup maintenance and insurance combined were $2,110. Health insurance was $3,600. Church giving and local donations averaged $1,200. Total personal spend sat near $14,960. He was not depriving himself for theater. He was buying optionality. Every $10,000 not spent became either better terms in a rent negotiation or faster response when somebody needed quick cash to avoid selling at the wrong moment. The social pressure intensified anyway. Operators he respected, good men and women with real skill, moved toward larger financed packages as commodity prices improved in the early 2000s. Payment schedules of $118,000 to $174,000 per year became normal in some circles, defended as the cost of efficiency and uptime. Brett did not sneer at them. He understood the logic. Newer equipment reduced labor bottlenecks and cut breakdown risk at the wrong hour. The trade-off was that one sequence of weak prices could turn fixed payments into a vice. He chose a different risk: more wrench time, less bank time. On a windy February afternoon in 2003, he and a neighbor pulled the engine on the salvage combine he had bought the previous year, set the block on a stand, and rebuilt it with remanufactured components that cost less than 1/4 of a single annual note on a late model replacement. The math on that machine became local folklore without anyone admitting it. Purchase 11,400. Parts 2,300. Additional belts, feeder chain, and labor supplies over 2 winters, 1,860. Total 15,560. Comparable financed unit at the time would have required more than 40,000 per year over multiple years once insurance and service contracts were included. One path demanded constant yields. The other tolerated bad weather. By late winter, 2004, the distance between those philosophies narrowed toward a collision in Hutchinson, where polished offices sold modern certainty, one payment schedule at a time, and a 31-year-old farmer in a rusted truck prepared to say no again. The glass doors at Prairie Crown Equipment opened against a hard March wind, and Brett Reynolds stepped into a showroom that smelled like tire shine and new paint. He carried a folded legal pad in his coat pocket and wore the same patched bib overalls, now with a fresh grease mark at the left knee from changing a hydraulic line before sunrise. Outside, his 1989 Ford F250 sat crooked in a visitor space, tailgate chain visible from the showroom window, rust lit up by noon sun like old iron left in a fence row. Inside, under bright halogen lights, stood a new combine package with a placard reading $286,000, 10% down, 7 years, 6.9%. Dale Mercer met him halfway across the tile floor in a pressed logo shirt, clean-stitched vest, polished belt buckle, and boots that still held factory edges on the soles. Dale did not lower his voice. "You are still running that salvage unit, Brett. At your size, downtime will bury you faster than payments. This package puts you in modern capacity now." He slid a printed sheet across his desk and tapped the annual figure with one finger. $49,362 before insurance, before service contracts, before seasonal pickup and delivery charges. He framed it as certainty. He called it manageable. Then he glanced toward the window at Brett's truck and gave a short laugh that carried farther than he intended. "You can keep wiring tailgates, or you can farm like this decade." Brett sat, read every line, and ran the arithmetic in silence. Down payment $28,600, finance balance $257,400, total scheduled payments over 7 years $345,534, plus estimated insurance at $4,900 per year, and mandatory service plan averaging $6,200, pushing real 7-year outlay beyond $423,000 if nothing major failed. He wrote one number on his legal pad, $136,000. That was the approximate spread between the principal price and likely all-in carrying cost if rates stayed flat, larger if diesel spikes forced operating carry. He stood, folded the paper once, and handed it back. "It does not fit my risk." Dale leaned back and smiled the way salesmen do when patience is wearing thin. "Risk is staying small forever." Brett answered in 7 words. "Debt can make small into gone." Then he walked out. By the first week of April 2004, he had already chosen the alternative path in detail. A fire-damaged 1996 combine chassis from a yard near Great Bend cost $17,800 cash, hauled on a borrowed detached trailer for $640 in fuel and permit expense. From 3 separate wrecking yards, he sourced a rebuilt rotor assembly for $4,250, feeder house components for $2,980, wiring harness and cab electronics for $1,740, hydrostatic pump parts for $3,120, and miscellaneous bearings, belts, and seals for $2,150. Total component spend came to $14,240. Add fluids, machine shop work, and one custom fabricated bracket at $360, and his all-in number settled at $33,040. He wrote that total in block letters on the top page of a new binder labeled No Note Acre Fund, then set an automatic transfer for $3,000 per month, equal to the machinery payment he had just refused. His backstory lived in those transfers more than in any speech he gave. The discipline had started years earlier as fear, then matured into method. After his father's variable rate debt shock in 1987, Brett kept old loan statements in a cardboard box under a workbench. On winter nights, he would read them as if they were weather records. One note began at 9.25%, reset to 10.8, then 12.1, and the annual interest line alone climbed by more than $4,000, while yields moved the wrong direction. He never forgot that mathematics can turn a competent farmer into a forced seller without any failure of character. In 1998, he had come within one signature of repeating the pattern, tempted by promotional terms on a newer tractor and planter package that advertised low initial burden. He took the quote home, rebuilt it with realistic maintenance and fuel assumptions, and saw that the affordable monthly number hit a full-cycle cost that consumed 2.5 average crop years from his owned 40 acres. He folded the offer and used the envelope as a shop shim. The larger community often interpreted his caution as timidity, but the ledger showed something else: structured aggression without lenders. He attacked inefficiency line by line. In 2000, he prepaid seed in December at a 3% discount, saving $1,140. In 2001, he bought diesel in coordinated fills with 2 neighbors and locked spring delivery at 1.07 per gallon, then split transport. In 2002, he shifted 1 rented quarter from custom application to his own calibrated rig, cutting per-acre application cost from 9.80 to 6.10 across 160 acres. In 2003, he renegotiated crop insurance options and trimmed premium outlay by $2,260 while keeping catastrophic protection. None of those decisions looked dramatic at coffee counters. Combined, they funded parts, reduced panic, and kept cash where timing mattered. That refusal in Hutchinson looked small from the road, but inside Brett's books it marked a clear hinge point, and the numbers that followed began separating reputation from balance sheet reality. He still remembered a specific afternoon in June 1994, when he learned that discipline had to be mechanical, not emotional. Wheat had come in better than expected on a small lease, and he nearly spent the margin on a newer pickup after seeing one parked outside a sale barn. Instead, he drove home, parked beside the machine shed, and wrote 2 columns on lined paper: status purchase versus productive asset. Pickup, $8,400 cash out, no yield increase plus higher insurance. Used grain drill and fence repair, $1,750 out. Direct planting reliability gain, and pasture lease viability. He chose the second column. That pattern repeated for a decade. If a purchase could not either lower unit cost, raise reliability, or secure acreage, it waited, sometimes forever. By harvest 2004, the rebuilt combine was running 22 to 24 engine hours a day when weather windows narrowed, and he logged each stop longer than 15 minutes on an index card clipped inside the cab. The first season downtime totaled 31 hours, mostly minor belt alignment, and 1 sensor failure. Dale's showroom claim had predicted catastrophic idle losses. Brett's actual field data put downtime at 4.3% of operating hours, below several newer units in the county that waited on dealer technicians during peak weeks. His full repair spend that year, including preventative work on the 4430 and 1486, came to $19,870. Nearby peers carrying newer finance fleets reported combined annual payment schedules from $118,000 to $174,000, not counting major depreciation. He did not ridicule those numbers. He compared them against one question: what survives 2 bad years in a row? His personal life stayed just as narrow and deliberate. He kept the farmhouse thermostat low in winter and insulated 2 drafty windows himself with rigid foam and cedar trim for $186 in materials. He repaired boots twice before replacement. He ate from the same chest freezer cycle and bought beef in halves with another family to lower per-pound cost. Annual personal spending in 2004 landed at about $14,960, with temporary fuel volatility absorbed by cuts elsewhere. When wheat cleared 52 bushels per acre on one rented block, he moved an additional $9,600 into the no-note acre fund instead of upgrading trucks. By New Year, monthly auto transfers had placed $36,000 in the account, and bonus deposits raised the year-end balance contribution to $49,200. Cash gives options. Options create bargaining power. Bargaining power buys time, and in farming, time is often the difference between holding ground and selling it. The early discipline showed most clearly at auctions, where he arrived with a folded cap, a thermos, and a ceiling price already written down. At a late 2004 retirement sale outside Beloit, a 6-row planter with a damaged marker arm drew little interest because paint had faded and one chain guard was missing. Brett bid $2,900, won at $3,100, and spent $740 on bearings, hoses, and a fabricated arm. Total $3,840. Dealer equivalent, even used, was listed near $18,500. At a winter consignment yard, he bought a gravity wagon for $420, rebuilt hubs for $190, and painted nothing because paint did not move grain. He purchased by function, not by pride, and that irritated people who preferred visible success markers. Yet every avoided payment had a destination and a date. One evening in February 2005, with sleet tapping the kitchen window, he updated the binder and drew 3 circles on the bottom of the page: reserve, rent, land. He had no machinery notes, no operating line draw, and a growing cash stack earning modest interest in insured accounts and short treasury ladders. The plan was not to stay small. The plan was to expand only when expansion could not evict him in a thin year. He had begun as the man other operators described as undercapitalized. Quietly, he was becoming overprepared. That same month, Dale Mercer mentioned him at a winter clinic in Hutchinson while presenting financing options to a crowd of 73 producers and landlords. Dale called Brett's line a museum strategy that cannot scale in modern agriculture. Several in the room nodded. A few laughed. Nobody noticed that Brett was not there because he was at a salvage yard checking unload auger, flighting on a neglected header trailer he would buy for $600 and rebuild for $280. The contrast was almost too clean. One room sold monthly payment comfort. One shed built unadvertised resilience. By the end of spring planting 2005, the first full-year effect of the no-note acre fund was visible in plain numbers. Starting balance 0. Automatic deposits 3,000 times 12 equals 36,000. Yield bonus transfers 13,400. Winter parts arbitrage savings, compared with in-season pricing, 4,860. Interest and treasury income, 1,040. Year-end fund total, 55,300. He left it untouched. That money was not emergency fuel. It was future dirt. He closed the binder, set it beside a stack of seed tags, and turned out the kitchen light. Outside sat the same rusted truck, same chain on the tailgate, same patched overalls drying on a chair. To anyone passing the county road, he still looked like a man one breakdown from quitting. On paper, he looked like a man preparing to buy his way out of dependence, one avoided payment at a time. At dawn the next morning, he reopened the binder on the same kitchen table, added one line under the $55,300 balance, and wrote a rule beneath it in block letters. Land purchases must come from surplus, never from urgency. That sentence shaped the next 9 years more than any market forecast did. By October 2005, he had added a second rented tract, 120 acres at $82 per acre, because the landlord wanted one clause that mattered more than price: guaranteed cleanup and fence maintenance after harvest. Brett accepted, prepaid half the rent in cash, and moved his total operated ground from 280 acres to 400. Gross revenue that year came in at $236,400 across wheat, milo, and custom work. Total production costs, rent, repairs, fuel, insurance, and labor help landed at $181,900. Net before taxes was $54,500. He transferred $42,000 into the no-note acre fund and left $12,500 in operating cash. He was not maximizing speed. He was maximizing survival odds. Then came the first compressed ledger stretch that local people never saw because it happened in notebooks, not at coffee counters. 2006, operated 520 acres. Average wheat yield 49 bushels per acre on dry land blocks. Milo variable. Gross $301,700. Full costs $227,900. Net $73,800. Year-end liquid reserve $94,300. No machinery debt, no operate note. 2007. Added 180 leased acres at $91 per acre, after a family wanted one operator for 3 disconnected parcels. Gross $356,200. Cost $271,600. Net $84,600. Repairs $23,440, including a transmission rebuild that would have triggered panic under annual notes, but only reduced surplus under his model. Reserve climbed to $146,800. 2008. Commodity volatility widened. He sold wheat in staged increments, not one emotional day, averaging a price that protected margin. Gross $418,900. Cost $309,300. Net $109,600. Year-end reserve $211,900. Treasury ladder allocation $120,000 at short durations. Average yield 2.9%. No liens filed against machinery. 2009. Operated 910 acres with tighter input control and one additional rented quarter near the Reno line at $103 per acre. Gross $497,400. Cost $371,500. Net $125,900. Reserve $287,200 after taxes and deferred parts orders. Repair budget $20,980. 2010. Operated 1,060 acres. Gross $574,300. Cost $430,900. Net $143,400. Reserve reached $388,400. He bought no new pickup, no showroom tractor, no convenience package. He bought 3 pallets of preseason parts at discount and 1 used grain cart for $9,800 cash. 2011, expanded to 1,220 acres, with 2 leases that required reliable planting windows and no excuses. Gross $649,700, cost $489,600, net $160,100, reserve $503,600. Average machinery repairs since 2005, 21,870 per year. 2012, operated 1,340 acres. Gross $711,500. Cost $550,200. Net $161,300. Reserve $612,100. No-note acre, fund and reserve accounts were now effectively one war chest with strict internal labels. 2013, operated 1,460 acres. Bought first major land tract, 160 acres at $2,150 per acre. Total $344,000. Paid in certified funds within 10 days. Closing costs and title work $6,740. End of year liquid position, after purchase, still above $320,000. That sequence looked slow to people, tracking horsepower and paint color. It looked aggressive to anyone, tracking net control and fixed obligations. Over the same window, nearby operators with modern finance fleets carried annual machinery payments between $118,000 and $174,000 before surprise repairs. Brett carried inconvenience, parts runs, and winter labor. They carried contractual outflows that did not care about rainfall. In early January 2011, Dale Mercer stood in a heated showroom aisle and used Brett as a cautionary example again. He called the Reynolds line a museum with lucky timing. He pointed to technology packages and said scale required commitment. He was not a cartoon villain. He was a competent salesman inside the paradigm that had rewarded him for years. Monthly payment framing, closed deals. Commission math favored turnover. The underlying conflict was not personality. It was time horizon. Dale optimized for this quarter and next model year. Brett optimized for the next bad cycle. Before we go any further, if you want to see how this arithmetic collides with drought, rate pressure, and 3 families on the edge, stay with this story to the end and subscribe for more case studies built on real farm math. By the spring of 2012, the contrast sharpened because good people made rational decisions inside a risk structure that later moved against them. Tyson Laird was one of them. Tyson farmed hard, kept clean records, and loved efficient field days. He financed 2 late-model tractors and a planter package for $412,000 at 5.8%, expecting strong corn and wheat years to carry the load. Annual principal and interest schedule was roughly $72,400, then insurance, precision subscriptions, and service agreements added another $21,000 to $26,000 depending on breakdown coverage. Total machinery burden often sat near $95,000. In high-yield years, it penciled. In thin years, it narrowed fast. Tyson was not reckless. He was exposed. Maria and Joel Vance made a similarly understandable bet from a different direction. Their hog facilities needed upgrades to remain compliant and competitive, and lenders were eager while commodity strength still supported expansion narratives. They refinanced and expanded with a $690,000 adjustable note that began at 4.1%. Their first-year payments were demanding but survivable. Feed costs then rose, 2 contract assumptions changed, and the note reset to 7.4%. Annual debt service increased by tens of thousands while margins weakened. They cut personal spending, sold equipment, and worked every possible side contract. It still was not enough runway. Calvin Doss carried the heaviest stack. Land obligations plus equipment loans reached approximately $1.2 million. Calvin had a reputation for clean fields and straight dealing. Then 2 poor wheat years hit back to back, while fertilizer and diesel climbed. Even small timing mistakes became expensive when interest meters never stopped. He restructured once, then again, then filed Chapter 12 because the alternative was uncontrolled liquidation. Brett attended hearings quietly and never treated Calvin as a warning poster. He treated him as a neighbor caught in tightening math. 3 days after one of those hearings, Brett went to a consignment sale where several people expected him to take advantage. He did bid, but only on neglected implements with clear utility and low carrying risk, a drill at $1,200 and a header trailer at $900. He also wrote private notes in the back of his ledger. Tyson needs low-cost planning window support if leases drop. Vance family may need hay equipment pivot. Calvin likely strongest in shop management if given stable salary, plus upside. Those lines looked speculative at the time. Later, they became architecture. Through 2013 and 2014, the social narrative still lagged the balance sheet reality. Brett arrived in the same faded coat. He still drove old trucks, eventually adding a 1998 Chevy grain truck with high miles and weathered paint because function beat appearance. Dale still had bidders lined up with pre-approval sheets whenever estate ground came available. Coffee counter consensus still favored speed and visible scale. Yet Brett now owned 200 acres free and clear, including inherited land, controlled 1,460 operated acres, and held cash buffers that could absorb a failed engine and a weak yield season without lender calls. By late summer 2014, margin compression began showing up in places that had looked strong on paper 2 years earlier. Input invoices rose. Basis moved against optimistic projections. Some landlords sought higher rents based on peak year assumptions that no longer held. Operators with large, fixed payment structures started rolling shortfalls into operating lines. The interest line became a second crop nobody wanted to grow. The real stress arrived in stages rather than one dramatic collapse. In 2015, yields disappointed across key tracks and grain prices did not rescue the shortfall. Tyson Laird lost 640 leased acres when landlords shifted to guaranteed arrangements he could not match under his payment obligations. He did not lose his character. He lost negotiating room. He sold one tractor under pressure and spent the winter recalculating from a smaller base. The Vance operation reached breaking point the same year. Their adjustable debt reset had already raised annual pressure, and sustained feed and maintenance costs left no cushion for one more weak quarter. They worked with lenders, then with attorneys, then with auction staff. The sale was orderly and respectful, but it was still a forced unwind of assets they had built over years. People in town spoke softly about it, because everyone understood how easily the same path could have been theirs. Calvin Doss held on longer than many expected, then filed when another poor wheat cycle overlapped rising fertilizer costs and tighter lending terms. Chapter 12 gave him structure, not shame. It preserved some options and prevented complete disarray, but it also confirmed the central lesson Brett had learned at 19. Debt is manageable until timing turns, and when timing turns, fixed obligations can outrun effort. By the first week of June 2016, drought made the arithmetic merciless. County yields dropped hard. Pasture conditions deteriorated. Diesel prices and parts costs remained volatile. Operating lenders across the region tightened lines, added conditions, or declined renewals for borrowers whose ratios no longer met policy thresholds. Some operators idled marginal ground because planting would require borrowed inputs with uncertain recovery. Brett planted, not because he guessed better weather, but because he had zero machinery debt, zero operating debt, and over $1,040,000 in liquid reserves with 480 owned acres, free and clear by then. He could buy seed, fuel, and fertilizer without seeking permission. At a landlord meeting in Hutchinson that summer, with several anxious operators at the table, Brett offered a 3-year guaranteed cash rent at $132 per acre on 900 acres, paid on schedule, without contingencies, tied to price or yield. Competitors offered higher upside percentages if markets improved, but they could not guarantee base payment through drought risk and lender review. Landlords chose certainty. Brett secured the acres without signing a banknote. That was the moment local perception finally started to bend. The man in patched bib overalls, running rebuilt equipment and old trucks, was no longer a curiosity surviving on grit. He was becoming the valley's most reliable operator because he had designed for bad years while others optimized for good years. And as the drought deepened, his ledger was no longer only a personal shield. It was about to become leverage for second chances. In August 2016, while heat shimmered above stubble and pasture ponds kept shrinking, Brett added a new tab to the same binder that had carried him through 2 decades of stubborn arithmetic. He labeled it Second Chance Ledger. He did not announce it. He built criteria. Any help had to preserve work capacity, avoid new high-interest debt, and include one practical obligation back to the community when stability returned. He was not designing charity theater. He was designing durable recovery. The first entry was Tyson Laird. Tyson still had skill, still had landlord trust in pockets, and still had enough machinery to work if he could lower fixed pressure. Brett offered a 3-year machinery use agreement on a rebuilt planter and grain cart from his own line, no markup, with a maintenance split and a seasonal payment that tracked actual harvested acres rather than a fixed monthly number. Year 1 payment target was $18,000, Year 2 $22,000, Year 3 $26,000, with flexibility for drought trigger adjustments. That replaced a financing burden that had been pushing near $95,000 in heavy years. Tyson accepted at his kitchen table, signed with a steady hand, and said only, "This gives me room to breathe." The second entry was Maria and Joel Vance. Their operation could not carry the old hog facility structure anymore, but they had dependable hay customers and strong custom baling relationships. Brett purchased a used baler package and mower setup for $96,400 cash, sourced through 2 auctions and 1 retirement sale, then structured a zero-interest 5-year note to the Vances at $19,280 per year beginning after the first full custom season. No compounding, no penalty for early payment. Their condition was simple: quarterly bookkeeping reviews and no additional variable rate borrowing. They agreed, and for the first time in 2 years, their planning conversation shifted from what to liquidate to what to build. By the spring of 2017, Brett's operated acres held at levels many people once claimed he could never sustain without dealer paper. But the deeper shift was cultural. Landlords now described him with one word: reliable. He guaranteed terms and met them in dry years, not only in favorable markets. That reputation mattered more than paint color. Across coffee counters and shop doors, one question kept surfacing as margins tightened again. When stress hits, Does durability come from the most horsepower or from the widest margin for error? That question followed everyone to an auction yard near South Hutchinson. The revelation came on a windy morning in April 2021 at a multi-family estate auction where 1,120 acres and a grain setup were being sold in tracts and combinations. Dale Mercer was there early, circulating with financing packets and pre-approval language, still polished, still quick, still confident in the model he had sold for years. He saw Brett arrive in faded overalls beside a 1998 Chevy grain truck showing 417,000 miles, primer patches on one door, and a cracked mirror held with black tape. Dale smiled and said to a small cluster near the clerk table, "The Junkyard caravan came to watch." A few laughed, not cruelly, habitually. Bidding moved fast once the larger parcels opened. Two finance groups pushed hard, then paused for lender confirmation windows tied to inspection, contingencies, and appraisal sequencing. Brett did not pause. When the combined package reached $3,780,000, he stepped forward and placed certified funds documentation on the clerk table with no financing condition, no post-auction bank review, and a 10-day close commitment already written by counsel. The auctioneer asked for confirmation twice. The clerk called the issuing bank, received verification, and nodded without expression. The room changed tone in less than 30 seconds. Dale asked to see the confirmation sheet, read it, and went quiet long enough that the silence did more than any argument could have done. He had built his career around monthly affordability framing. Brett had just removed time from the equation entirely. No lender delay meant no window for financed bidders to regroup. No contingencies meant no leverage to reopen terms. Deal structure, not drama, ended the contest. The final posted numbers were blunt. Controlled operation, 3,480 acres. Owned acreage, 1,760. Independent appraisal of land, grain assets, equipment, and liquid positions placed Brett's net worth at $11,940,000. The man many people had described as undercapitalized for 20 years had been carrying the strongest balance sheet in the valley, while looking like he might need a jump start in the parking lot. He did not stay for congratulations. He signed closing instructions, thanked the clerk, and left before lunch to check a hydraulic leak on a drill toolbar. 3 weeks later, at the county ag banquet in a room of just over 200 producers, lenders, landlords, and equipment staff, Dale gave a shorter speech than usual. He admitted that Brett's cash discipline had outperformed machinery packages sold through the previous decade. He did not apologize in dramatic terms. He did something harder for a salesman. He changed his premise in public. Brett's response came in one paragraph from the back of the room when asked what he planned to do next. "I am setting up a revolving zero-interest equipment fund with $1,200,000. Written terms, no variable rates, no hidden fees. You mentor one new producer within 5 years, or you do not qualify again." Then he sat down. What followed kept the same logic that had carried him from mocked outlier to certified funds buyer. Structure first, then scale. The generosity phase looked disciplined because that was the only way it could scale. Brett and a local attorney drafted plain language agreements capped at 8 pages each. Every note listed principal, fixed zero interest, expected payment windows tied to harvest cycles, drought contingency clauses, and the mentorship requirement. No compounding clauses, no teaser rates, no rollover penalties that quietly become ownership traps. From mid-2021 through late 2023, 7 notes were executed under that fund, totaling $846,000. These were distinct from Brett's 2016 bilateral arrangements with Tyson and the Vances. Those earlier agreements predated the fund, while the 2021 to 2023 disbursements were separate revolving fund notes tied to later performance milestones. Tyson received $164,000 for equipment stabilization and field-ready upgrades after meeting 2 years of conservation and payment targets. Maria and Joel Vance received $128,000 across hay and hauling assets that matched their new custom model. Calvin Doss, who had moved from crisis management to disciplined rebuild work, received $142,000 tied to expanding the parts and rebuild shop he now managed for Brett on salary plus profit share. 2 beginning operators in Reno County each received down payment matches of $75,000 for starter acreage contracts with strict cash reserve rules attached. 2 additional drought-hit operators received $131,000 and $131,000 in structured equipment notes after independent review of their books. Alongside the notes, Brett issued 4 emergency input grants of $12,500 each during a dry spell that spiked seed and fertilizer stress. Grants were one-time and non-repayable, designed to prevent forced liquidations at the worst possible point in the cycle. He kept those grants separate from notes on purpose. When the need was immediate and small relative to long-run viability, debt was the wrong instrument. By the second week of January 2024, the deeper examination could be stated with the same clarity Brett had always preferred. Compare fixed outflow burden against retained control of timing. His records from 2004 to 2021 showed cumulative machinery repairs and rebuild expenditures of approximately $548,000 across major units, compared with modeled financed replacement pathways that ranged from $2,940,000 to $3,460,000 in combined principal, interest, insurance, service contracts, and depreciation exposure for equivalent capacity over the same period. Even using conservative assumptions, avoided outflow landed between $2,392,000 and $2,912,000. That spread alone covered most of the 2021 auction-certified funds down to the first decimal tier. The year-by-year sequence after drought made the pattern even harder to dismiss. 2016, liquid reserves 1,040,000, owned acres 480, 0 machinery debt, 0 operating debt. 2017, controlled acres 2,360 after new leases, net operating surplus 312,000 despite dry conditions. Second Chance Ledger launched. 2018, surplus 418,000 with staged grain marketing and strict parts budgeting. Additional treasury allocations 260,000. 2019, surplus 503,000. Bought 240 acres at blended 2,480 per acre, total 595,200 cash, plus 11,900 closing costs. 2020, surplus 447,000 under volatile logistics. Liquidity preserved above 1,900,000 across cash and short-duration instruments. 2021, estate auction, purchased 3,780,000 certified funds, owned acres 1,760, appraised net worth 11,940,000. 2022, revolving fund disbursements accelerate. Repayments begin from first recipient cycle. Fund balance remains above 900,000 due to stage structure. 2023, Total active notes, 846,000. Default rate 0. Mentorship matches initiated for 5 new producers. This was the non-trivial insight most people missed when they focused on visible austerity. Brett was never anti-growth. He was anti-fragility. He accepted older equipment and more winter labor to avoid contractual cash drains that removed decision-making freedom in bad years. The resulting optionality let him guarantee rents, close quickly, and buy when others were forced to wait. Then, once scale was secure, the same framework financed recovery for neighbors without repeating the debt structures that had hurt them. Recipient trajectories proved the multiplier effect better than any slogan. Tyson's reduced fixed burden and conservation-linked lease terms rebuilt his lender profile within 2 seasons and stabilized 320 acres under management. The Vances shifted from distressed livestock debt to profitable custom hay operations with predictable seasonal cash flow and began prepaying portions of their zero-interest note ahead of schedule. Calvin turned shop expertise into structured income and profit share, then hired 2 technicians during peak rebuild months, converting personal hardship into local employment capacity. The 2 beginning farmers, who took $75,000 matches each, entered land contracts without stripping working capital, which prevented the usual first-year scramble for expensive, short-term operating money. Add those trajectories together and the arithmetic scales beyond one farm. By late 2023, direct recipients under Brett's notes, grants, leases, and matches were controlling thousands of acres with improving equity positions, and each agreement carried one requirement that compounded quietly: mentor someone else when stable. That clause was not moral decoration. It was replication logic. Dale watched this transition from a different seat. After Prairie Crown sold its Hutchinson branch in 2024, he stayed in the industry as a used equipment broker and changed his pitch language in ways old clients noticed immediately. He started leading with total cost over full cycle, not monthly payment alone. He spoke more about downside years and less about showroom confidence. He did not become Brett. He adjusted to reality that Brett's ledger had made unavoidable. On a cold morning outside Concordia, months after the auction headlines faded, Brett was back at his shop door before sunrise, patched overalls, work gloves, pencil behind one ear, checking inventory bins with Calvin before trucks rolled. The truck in the yard still looked tired. The balance sheet did not. And the valley had started learning, line by line, that quiet arithmetic can protect more families than pride ever will. Calvin read out the bin counts while Brett marked each line in pencil, then tore the sheet cleanly from the pad and clipped it to the second chance ledger. He had started scanning those pages at month end and storing copies with his accountant in Concordia and with the attorney in Hutchinson, not because he expected trouble, but because memory is weaker than paper when money and gratitude begin to mix. By the end of that week, he had converted every active note to a simple annual scorecard. Acres managed, gross margin, repair discipline, cash reserve ratio, and mentorship hours delivered. He was not measuring people to control them. He was measuring systems so recovery could be repeated. By harvest 2024, the first full recipient cycle under the revolving fund was complete, and the outcomes were concrete enough that even skeptics stopped calling it charity. Tyson Laird had shifted from survival mode to planned rebuilding. Brett leased Tyson 320 acres at $118 per acre, while comparable ground nearby was bringing roughly 146, with one condition that mattered long-term. Tyson had to hold residue cover targets and document soil tests every season. Lower rent freed cash, conservation stabilized productivity, and the ledger reflected both. Tyson's annual machinery burden, once near $95,000 in heavy years, was replaced by structured use costs and targeted upgrades. His year-end retained earnings moved from $34,200 in 2023 to $129,600 in 2024, then $171,400 in 2025. By spring 2026, he had rebuilt enough liquidity to prepay seed on 70% of his acres and carried no variable rate machinery paper. The note terms had given him time. His own discipline did the rest. Maria and Joel Vance followed a different recovery curve, but it was just as clear. Their custom hay pivot became viable because the equipment matched their workload instead of somebody else's expansion model. With the $96,400 package from 2016 and the later $128,000 fund note, they built a route book across Reno and Cloud counties that prioritized dependable contracts over speculative volume. In 2024, they completed 312 custom jobs. In 2025, they completed 347, with lower per-job downtime after Calvin's shop standardized preseason inspections. Their restructured liabilities, once the weight that dictated every decision, fell below $90,000 by late 2025 and were fully paid in 2026. They kept modest salaries, built a cash buffer equal to 8 months of operating expense, and stopped discussing emergency liquidation because the emergency had ended. Calvin Doss became the backbone of the rebuild shop almost quietly. Brett paid him a fixed salary of $78,000, plus a profit share formula that distributed 18% of annual net shop profit above a $140,000 baseline. In 2024, that meant an additional $21,960. In 2025, it meant $34,740. Calvin used the money without spectacle, paid down old legal balances, repaired his house roof, and funded tooling that reduced turnaround time for in-season failures across recipient farms. The $142,000 note attached to his expansion plan performed on schedule, and by mid-2026 he had repaid $64,000 principal with no missed installments. His son enrolled in community college under the $48,000 Reynolds Scholarship, spread across tuition and technical program costs. The scholarship was paid directly to the school each term, documented in the same binder, and marked complete for year 2 with grades attached to the file. 2 beginning operators in Reno County, Evan Pike and Nora Hale, were the clearest proof that Brett's system was no longer about one personality. Each received a $75,000 down payment match. Each was required to hold at least 6 months of projected input costs in reserve, and each signed a covenant against variable rate machinery debt for the first 5 years. Evan took 210 acres on a starter contract and focused on wheat and milo with strict repair ceilings. Nora took 190 acres plus custom drilling work and built margin through low overhead. By 2026, Evan's equity position had risen to an estimated $418,000 and Nora's to about $391,000, both ahead of their original amortization schedules because they avoided high fixed outflows during weak pricing windows. The 4 emergency input grants of $12,500 each did what they were designed to do. They did not create headlines. They prevented forced decisions. One operator used the grant to cover fertilizer timing and avoided selling a tractor at a discount. Another bridged seed and diesel through a dry spell and held a lease that would have been lost under delayed planting. All 4 filed written after-action reports in Brett's format, and all 4 remained in operation through 2026. Small money at the right hour preserved much larger value. Let me stop here and ask you something. When you evaluate growth in your own work, do you track visible size first or fragility first? Put your answer in the comments, then keep following the numbers because the next phase settled the oldest argument in the valley. Dale Mercer's resolution was slower and more honest than a dramatic apology. After Prairie Crown sold the Hutchinson branch in 2024, Dale moved into used equipment brokerage with lower overhead and fewer commission incentives tied to high balance financing. At first, older clients expected the same script from him. They did not get it. He started every proposal with full-cycle cost tables, purchase, repair forecast, insurance, likely depreciation, and stress case revenue assumptions at lower yields and weaker prices. He still sold newer units when they made sense, but he stopped presenting monthly payment as the central truth. He had watched too many good operators get cornered by timing. By early 2025, Dale was hosting winter workshops with a different format. 1 hour on machinery options, so 1 hour on debt structure risk, 1 hour on contingency planning for 2 consecutive weak years. He brought in a local accountant, a crop insurance specialist, and once, without fanfare, Calvin Doss to explain what breakdown economics looked like from a shop floor when cash was tight. The irony was sharp but not bitter. The salesman who once dismissed Brett's fleet as a museum was now teaching younger producers to compare total obligation against downside capacity before signing anything. He also resolved his own business model in arithmetic. In his final year at Prairie Crown, about 82% of his volume had been financed new equipment with bundled service. By 2026, his brokerage mix was closer to 57% inspected used units, 29% rebuilt or reconditioned lines, and only 14% new packages. His income became less volatile. His clients defaulted less. He told one landlord in public, "Monthly payment is a line item. Survival is the full page." It was the closest thing he gave to a confession, and it was enough. If you are learning something from this kind of farm arithmetic, share this story with someone who still thinks appearance is the same as strength. By June 20 to 26, the roll call could be read without gaps. Brett Reynolds owned 2,040 acres, free and clear, operated 3,620 total acres under a mix of owned ground and disciplined leases, and carried no bank debt. His 1974 John Deere 4430 still ran after another winter top-end refresh. The 1978 International one, 486, still handled tillage and grain cart duty, and the rebuilt combine line remained in service with scheduled off-season tear-down intervals that Calvin now supervised. The 1998 Chevy grain truck, still patched and still loud on cold starts, stayed in the fleet because replacement had no economic advantage yet. The old Ford with the tailgate chain was parked in the back lot, not scrapped, used for short parts runs and fence tools. Nothing became a museum piece. Everything stayed functional. Tyson Laird now leased 320 acres from Brett under the conservation-linked arrangement, farmed an additional 260 acres independently, and had rebuilt enough equity to negotiate from stability instead of urgency. Maria and Joel Vance operated their custom hay business full-time, finished their restructured liabilities, and hired seasonal help during peak-cutting windows. Calvin Doss managed the parts and rebuild shop with 2 full-time technicians and 1 apprentice each summer, and his son remained in college with scholarship support on schedule. Evan Pike and Nora Hale met all reserve covenants and had each completed their first mentorship year with newer entrants. Dale Mercer remained in the industry, no longer chasing volume at any cost, and his revised approach kept more clients solvent through thin seasons. The multiplier effect was no longer theoretical. Direct recipients of Brett's leases, notes, matches, grants, and linked mentorships controlled about 5,260 acres by 2026, with combined estimated equity above $18,300,000. That figure did not belong to Brett. That was the point. His own balance sheet had become a platform that lowered failure risk for other families without pretending risk could be removed entirely. The philosophy endured because it was specific. Avoid fragile debt structures, retain timing control, buy assets that survive bad years, and convert surplus into second chances with clear terms. Before this story closes, subscribe if you want more real case studies where numbers decide outcomes. Then comment with one specific figure you track differently now, whether it is repair budget, cash reserve months, or total debt service. Finally, share this with one producer, landlord, or young operator who is being judged by what they drive instead of what they own. That evening, long after the shop lights were off, Brett stood at the edge of a wheat field north of Concordia, while wind moved through heads turning gold. He wore the same patched overalls, held the same pencil, and looked like a man who had never cared about being noticed. Behind him sat old machines that still worked, old trucks that still hauled, and a ledger that had outlived ridicule. In the valley where people once measured strength by paint and payments, the strongest operation had been built by a man who measured it by what he could owe no one and still give away. He stayed there until the light dropped off the wheat and the field turned bronze, then walked back toward the yard where one shop window still glowed over Calvin's workbench. Inside, Calvin had already set out the 4 after-action reports from the drought grants, each one signed, each one matched to receipts and planning maps. Brett washed his hands at the utility sink, sat down, and read every page again, not quickly and not out of distrust. The first operator had used the $12,500 to lock fertilizer before a price jump and documented a $37 per acre savings across 220 acres. The second had bridged seed and diesel and kept a lease that would have terminated after delayed planting. The third had avoided selling a field cultivator at a distressed $8,000 discount. The fourth had carried payroll for 2 weeks and finished harvest with no missed wages. Brett marked each file closed, then wrote one line beneath the stack. Grants prevented forced liquidation. Objective met. Calvin watched him cap the pen and said, "You still check these like an auditor." "I check them like weather," Brett said. "Patterns matter." On the shelf above them sat the cardboard box of his father's old loan statements, the pages that had taught him what rate resets can do to a good farm. He took the box down, sorted every statement by year, scanned them with the same machine he used for note records, and put the originals into a fireproof cabinet beside the no-note acre binders from 2004 forward. Nothing stayed loose now. Not money, not memory. By the first Monday of September 2026, the shop had become a place where repayment and mentorship happened in the same room. Tyson arrived before sunrise with Evan Pike, both carrying soil test folders and residue photos for annual review. Tyson's numbers were no longer defensive. On 580 total acres under his management that season, he posted gross revenue of $684,200, all-in operating costs of $492,900. And retained earnings of $191,300. Cash reserve ratio sat at 0.68 of annual input needs, up from 0.193 years earlier. He slid the sheet across the table and did not smile until Brett nodded. "Your lease condition held," Brett said, tapping the conservation line. residue cover targets met on every tract. Tyson looked at Evan, then back at Brett. I used to chase bushels first. Now I protect next year first. Evan followed with his own page. On 210 acres, he had kept machinery repair to $14,600 against a $22,000 ceiling, prepaid 62% of seed, and avoided short-term operating paper entirely. The $75,000 down payment match had moved his interest burden low enough that 1 weak quarter did not break his structure. Brett approved the next mentorship credit in the ledger and clipped both packets together. The replication logic was no longer theoretical. It was line-item verified. 3 days later, Maria and Joel Vance walked into the office at the old grain setup with a cashier's check and a spiral notebook full of custom job logs. Joel set the check down first. $19,280. Final scheduled installment on the 2016 hay equipment note. Maria set down the notebook second, opened to a page with 347 completed jobs in 2025 and 356 booked for 2026, with average collection time under 21 days. Their $128,000 revolving fund note from 2022 had also dropped below half principal, helped by 2 early payments made after a strong cutting window. Maria touched the edge of the check as if confirming it was real. No resets, no surprises. We could finally plan. Joel added, "We slept this summer." Brett endorsed the receipt copy, handed it back, and said only, "Keep your reserve at 8 months. Do not negotiate against that." They laughed, the kind that comes after years without room to laugh, and before they left, Maria pinned a new route map on the office wall with red lines through Reno and Cloud counties. Their business was no longer a recovery project. It was stable work on stable terms. Calvin's own review came at quarter end with the accountant on speaker from Concordia, and the attorney in Hutchinson patched into the call to certify compliance on every active note. The audit closed clean. 7 revolving notes totaling $846,000, 0 defaults, 0 variable rate clauses, 0 hidden fee disputes, all mentorship obligations current or scheduled. Shop net profit for the year to date stood at $241,700, triggering another profit share distribution for Calvin. He took his copy of the sheet, folded it once, and said, almost embarrassed, "My son registered spring classes this morning. Tuition is covered through year 2. The Reynolds scholarship line in the ledger showed $24,000 disbursed, $24,000 reserved, and grade reports filed each term. Nothing symbolic, paid and documented. When winter workshops opened in January 2027, Dale Mercer stood at the front of a community room in Hutchinson beside a projector screen that displayed 2 columns, monthly payment story and full-cycle cost story. He no longer wore dealership colors. His brokerage logo was small, his tone measured, and his first slide used a case model everyone in the room recognized without seeing names. New combine package over 7 years. Purchased $286,000, down payment $28,600, scheduled payments $345,534, estimated insurance $34,300, service contracts $43,400, likely depreciation exposure over cycle $118,000, total economic burden $541,234. Rebuild strategy variant, $32,040 all in initial, annual repairs averaged over life cycle, downtime contingency reserve, total materially lower fixed risk. Dale did not romanticize old equipment. He taught trade-offs. At the break, he walked to Brett near the coffee urn and handed him a laminated copy of the 2004 quote sheet from Prairie Crown. The same numbers, same terms, his own signature in the corner from 23 years earlier. "I kept this after that day," Dale said. "I gave you that look at the auction because I knew finally what this paper had cost other people." Brett studied the page and slid it into his coat pocket. "Then teach it right." Dale nodded once. "That is the work now." By March 2027, the roll call held steady with no missing names. Brett Reynolds owned 2,040 acres free and clear and operated 3,620 under leases he could guarantee without bank debt. Tyson Laird farmed 580 acres total, including 320 leased from Brett under conservation targets, and carried no variable rate machinery obligations. Maria and Joel Vance ran custom hay full-time, completed their restructured liabilities in 2026, and hired 3 seasonal workers during peak cutting. Calvin Doss managed the parts and rebuild shop with 2 full-time technicians and 1 apprentice, with salary and profit share both current. Calvin's son remained in community college with scholarship disbursements on schedule. Evan Pike and Nora Hale each met reserve covenants. Each maintained their starter acreage contracts, and each completed mentorship commitments with first-year operators entering the same framework. The 4 drought grant operators all remained active and solvent through the 2026 close. Dale Mercer continued as a used equipment broker, publicly centered total cost analysis, and reduced high-balance financing concentration in his client base. The machines remained what they had always been, tools, not trophies. The 1974 John Deere 4430 passed another winter inspection with 14,900 hours showing, and compression still within working range after top-end service. The 1978 International 1486 kept grain cart duty with a rebuilt hydraulic pump, logged at 1,120 hours since install. The rebuilt combine line ran with planned tear-down intervals and documented parts inventories under Calvin's system. The 1998 Chevy grain truck still started rough in cold weather and still hauled. The 1989 Ford F-25O still wore rust on the rocker panels and still used that grain auger chain on the tailgate latch. Nobody fixed it for appearances, because appearances had never been the point. At dusk on the last day of wheat harvest, Brett parked that Ford at the edge of the same field, north of Concordia, shut the engine off, and listened to the ticks of cooling metal. In the cab beside him sat 3 things: the laminated 2004 quote from Dale, the latest mentorship scorecards clipped and signed, and a penciled acreage map for next season, with rent guarantees already matched to cash. Behind him, lights moved across ground worked by families who had nearly been pushed out and now had terms they could survive. The valley had not changed because one man won an argument. It changed because arithmetic, applied without ego and repeated for decades, proved a stronger foundation than status. The farmer who looked poorest at the elevator had become the one with the most control, not to stand above neighbors, but to keep more of them in the game. Quiet discipline built the balance sheet. Debt avoidance protected it. Structured generosity multiplied it. And under a Kansas sky going dark over paid-for iron, that was the whole thesis, fully earned.